Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our last summer book review. The summer is coming to a close, not the heat, but the summer is coming to a close. If you are interested in seeing any of our other wonderful book reviews that we had over the course of the summer, I encourage you to look at our Christ the King YouTube page, and you will find it there in a specialized section entitled Summer Book Reviews. So without further ado, this is Dr. Andrew Achenbaum, and he will be presenting on his book, Safeguarding Social Security for All Generations. Andrew?
It costs $40 to paperback. And since you're all on Social Security one way or another, you're just gonna have to trust me. It was published by something other than a fastidious press, but don't buy it. I actually owe Pastor Rodriguez and Pastor Dorr an enormous gratitude for having me come. The last one, of course, therefore it's extra innings, but because of the 6 o'clock contemplative service. I'm one of the 11% of baby boomers who feels he's both religious and spiritual. And this sanctuary on Saturday night is really a sanctuary. I actually met Father Roger in 1968 when he had a group in southern France doing Taizé. And so for much of my life, I didn't have Taizé. And then I went to St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, and first Friday, we taught they did Taizé. And then after COVID, I came here, and Ben plays Taizé, and Taizé, and Taizé. And there are long moments of silence. My wife thinks that I'm an uber extrovert, but I'm actually fairly introverted. And so having these moments, long silence, they call it grand silence, short silence, and meditation is profoundly important to me. And despite a checkered biography, Jewish grandfather came to America escaping a pogrom. Following the rise of David Levinsky, married a 19th century German Lutheran. On my mother's side, a Jesuit family from Maryland married people who were less august than she thought they were. But I'm in many ways a US historian because I studied 20th, 19th, 18th, and 17th century history. Today, because it's here, I want to admit that during some of the grand silences, I looked through the leaflet and I was very impressed by what this church affirmed last May in terms of its values. And so despite the fact that this is Zoomed, and I assume you will censor it appropriately, I would like to juxtapose your commitments of faith with Franklin Roosevelt, namely, and go back to 1935. I suspect that some of you were alive during Roosevelt's presidency. I just missed him. There's one at least. Anyone else admitting? One, just one. Huh.
Oh, I'm sure.
Okay, well, so let's go. And we'll start with Andy's guide. And one of the commitments you made that impressed me was that we are spirit-led. And as I said, coming to the contemplative serving made me feel like I was part of this community, even though I'm just a contributor. Critical thinkers. I have no idea how many of you are academics, but I suspect if you're willing to get up at 9:30 on Sunday morning, you think critically. And that critical thinking is something that Rice and schools that you went to put a valence on. Engaged in a learning journey with others. We're old. We're not dead. And adult education programs exist, but I suspect that a fair number of you just read on your own, as I do. I will admit, but it has nothing to do with this, that I read Anna Karenina for the first time this summer and could not believe how smart Tolstoy was. And that first sentence, all families are screwed up, but screwed up in different ways.
Yeah.
I think he phrased it a little bit more felicitously. It gets us to Roosevelt, 1934. He's president and he's fishing. I'm looking for a sound means which I can recommend to provide against several of the great disturbing factors of life, especially those which relate to unemployment and old age. They are the essential fulfillment of measures already taken towards relief, recovery, and reconstruction. Those of you who did not sleep through a US history class in your 11th grade know that the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reconstruction, was the format of the first New Deal. And the guy's fishing. I'm looking for a sound means that relate to unemployment and old age. And 2 months later, his whole team was looking at unemployment because it's the Great Depression. And unemployment among middle-class, white, basically male workers was really bad. And he said, actually, it's old age, which I want to talk about. And so you can imagine being on his expert team and going, unemployment, unemployment, unemployment. And he's saying, no, old age dependency. He says he's fishing, but in fact, as governor of New York, he passed one of the most liberal old age dependency and insurance programs with his girlfriend, Frances Perkins. She wasn't really a girlfriend like the World War I affair, but she was a kindred spirit. We'll talk about her in a second. They are the essential fulfillment. We're on a learning journey. I don't know where we're going, but dollars will get you donuts, even with that crummy Supreme Court. I will have this Social Security be an essential fulfillment of measures which vindicate the first New Deal, which for those of you who took AP history was actually nullified by the Supreme Court. He tried to stack things, and it's the Social Security Act, which as part of the second New Deal vindicated the first New Deal. Roosevelt was an aristocrat, an Anglican. And I mean a New York Anglican, which is different than this low church stuff that goes on in the Diocese of Texas. And Mama was a tough broad. And he was an aristocrat. And as I already alluded, he nearly ruined his political career and his marriage with an affair with a woman who was the Secretary of Navy during World War I. But Mama said, unlike Queen Elizabeth, you have to stay in this marriage. And Eleanor, who did very little with Social Security, of course, proved to be his right-hand man. This stud, this Harvard mediocre C student, contracts polio. Can you imagine? Midlife, he's a cripple. And Eleanor, quiet, not so good looking Eleanor, had the tenacity and the courage to say, we can do it. She was his legs. And as we now know, looking at her biography, she was more than his legs. She was his soulmate, and she was an extraordinary character. He told her, and then in a public speech said, this is why this is the Lutheran study. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Doubts. We're all AARP subscribers. We're thinking about lots of things, existential and essential. The organ recital will vastly surpass anything that goes on in the 11 o'clock service. So we have doubts. But Roosevelt had the doubts. He understood that the country was gripped in fear. Fear. That hot button that most of us are unwilling to articulate, but most of us feel. Will I be left alone? Will I lose my brain? Will I lose my job? Will I lose me? There is nothing to fear but fear itself, he announced in his inaugural address in 1933. And fear gripped this country. Let's leave aside World War II, Hitler, and all the rest of that. This country plummeted after Gatsby's America in the 1920s. Banks closed. My mother, who said she was wealthy, these things are all relative in the age of Bezos and Musk, lost their bank. The bank just went out of business. And her father was the president of the bank, so their fortune was gone in 2 days. I don't know if it was a fortune, but she was poor. She was not used to being poor, but she was poor. Her father was a gentleman farmer, so he sort of kept a job, but I suspect the income flow didn't look as good in 1929 and 1930 as it had looked in 1924. And then you just cut across the country. Unemployment was 25%. Biden gets no credit for unemployment being the lowest in post-war America, but 25% is significant. And Geezer's unemployment was 33% because the country was ageist. You may probably don't know what the word ageism means, but it means discrimination against people. They were over the hill. Get rid of them. Let kids work. And then he has his academic soulmate, Frances Perkins, an amazing woman. She was a Perkins. Those of you who are Texas bred probably don't understand the intricacies of Boston aristocracy, but her family was Mayflower, and Perkins were a big deal in the 19th and 20th century. She went to Mount Holyoke. I went to a college near Mount Holyoke, and actually the second time around married a Mount Holyoke woman. These seven sister schools are very, very interesting people. And Frances there decided, I like being a French major. I like being a philosophy major. And she went off to Chicago to teach for a couple of years. And somewhere in that period, she was class of '02, there was the fire, the warehouse fire in New York, and she got interested in settlement. So she came back to Columbia, took a master's in economics and sociology, and then became political. She married. Her name was actually Frances Carolyn Perkins Wilson. And Wilson, 10 years into the marriage, suffered a bipolar disease. And so in many ways, her fears paralleled Franklin Roosevelt's. Here were people who were clearly part of the elite, not Obamas or Clintons, technocrats, but they were clearly the first families of America who suffered it. They understood vulnerability. And the two of them, in New York first, and then in Washington during the first New Deal, and obviously during the second New Deal, it's not by accident that FDR put her in charge of passing the Social Security Act. And for those of you who think I'm not talking about Lutherans enough, the real guidepost guy was Edwin Whitty from Wisconsin, who, bless his heart, was a German Lutheran. Part two. We will collaborate with individuals, faith communities, and other organizations with shared values. I wrote that and I thought, shared values. Shared values. The next president of the United States may win indictment of the world awards for his 91 indictments. And as a transplanted Yankee who's lived in Texas for 25 years, I'm going to be more open and candid about my politics here than I would be when I stepped out of this sanctuary. We're polarized. Sharing values is tough. Heck, talking about values is tough. David Brooks goes on about common morality and teaching moral education, but Rice pushes DEI. Thank God they're a private institution. I taught for 20 years at the University of Houston. We got a $2 billion endowment for Patrick, but I suspect I'd lose my tenure in 2 minutes. Shared values are not part of our political discourse. But it was then, sort of. Despite black, white, male, female, north, south, Protestant, Catholic. Roosevelt, on signing the Social Security Act on August 14th, we can never ensure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life. He has hope. I bet, obviously I didn't meet him, although I took a class with one of his sons in college, 100%. And that's what Yale, Harvard, places like that pushed. You gotta not only be good, gotta be perfect. Roosevelt was a C student who knew the world didn't quite operate that way. We can never ensure 100%. We may think we live in a risk-free society, but you're old enough to know that's not true. There are lots of risks in this town with takeovers of schools, order, with laws in the past, against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes. What a wonderful world. Vicissitude, it's like vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. Heck, you're Lutherans. You know you're going to die. And you know that this grace is really kind of important in that whole story. But at the moment, I have some doubts. I have some fears. But we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age. Roosevelt had hope, but it was measured hope. And it seems to me that's something that we crypto geezers have. Of course, we're hopeful. I've got 2 grandkids. I worry that their kids are going to parboil in 40 years. I don't worry about them getting Social Security for reasons that were clear in the op-ed page, but I really worry about the state of democracy. I worry about patriotism. I want to give some measure, not a blank check, it's not a welfare dole, but I'd like to build some institutional work under the law, which the Supreme Court will not create, to help the average citizen. And I'm sure what he had in mind were those unemployed white workers who had been displaced by the rain, and to his family. This gets too technical and time's running short, but the 1939 amendments really did cover the family in a way that he couldn't say in 1935, against the loss of a job. A job. Who am I? My mistress is my work. And against a poverty-ridden old age. In 1935, the poverty rate among senior citizens was 67%.
Oh my goodness.
67%. And these had been hardworking, middle-class Americans who just lost it during the Great Depression. And they weren't even sure about the 67%. They were good economists. They sort of took the high figure, the low figure, took the mean, and that was 67%. But in 1935, a Gallup poll, we still have Gallup polls, reported that 90% of those surveyed, you gotta watch these pollsters, you watch the news today, you can't trust a damn thing you read unless it comes from some college in Connecticut you've never heard of. So 89%. 89%. Even if they're fudging, that's more than 31% of the Republicans are going to vote for Trump. Of those surveyed, supported old age assistance for the needy. How un-American? Old age assistance? Needy? This is America, baby. Keep your job. But 89% of them were so impressed initially by what Roosevelt did that they supported this measure. And of course, one of the pornographic secrets of the day is that most of us support Social Security. And even more interestingly, my kids in their 40s support Social Security. I think they don't want daddy and his second wife showing up at their apartment. I think they're hoping there will be enough of a trust fund back chance that they'll be able to live somewhat more comfortably. And even if they don't get it, even if they don't get as much as we get, and heck, we got a 12% raise last year. This is big stuff. I never got a merit raise 12%. 89% supported. Well, this is an honest group and there are three questions and answers. But let me admit that all values were not shared. The third verse from your Lutheran covenant. As partners, so much for self-reliance, so much for rugged individualism. As partners, we will engage in just, we're going to come back to that word just, relationships with others within limits, within measured hope, with healthy boundaries, fiscal accountability, shared vision, and clear communications. Can you imagine anyone on Wednesday night being able to say those words with a straight face? Oh, Tucker will get Donald to say it, but we've seen fiscal accountability. We've seen healthy boundaries. We've seen his shared vision. And clear communication, I'm glad I'm not teaching. I don't know how I could interpret the Trump union. But Alf Landon knew, the governor from Kansas, this act is unjust, unworkable, stupidly drafted. It's a hoax. It's a fraud. And Franklin Roosevelt, a good Episcopalian, went to bed every night and said, thank God for Alf Landon. And the Americans gave him a roaring endorsement for the second term. Roosevelt in his second term. The Social Security Act offers to all of us a workable and working method of meeting against present needs and forestalling future needs. He was a C student. I suspect he slept through every Harvard class of history he took. But he knew there were traditions, and he knew there was a past, an American core of fibers. And so he was convinced that an institutional framework would take care of present needs. It's 1938. There was a recession in 1937, and people blamed the Social Security Act because people were chipping in and they thought it affected it. So he turns around, maybe a C student, but he's a student. He says, let's have another think tank. And so he brings in J. Douglas Brown from Princeton, a first-class provost and super economist, and an arch Presbyterian, who says, we can expand Social Security, not contract Social Security. And so in 1939, Social Security flipped. This is not a social work class or an advanced history class, so I'll spare you some of the details. But essentially what the 1939 amendments did is took the 1935 Act, which said, I fork over money to FICA and taxes, and I get back some equitable return on what I gave, up to a certain limit. There was only a certain amount of money. In 1939, they shifted to adequacy. That is to say, people who made less money than I made got a bigger return on their Social Security. And more importantly, if I die before this talk is over, my spouse gets money. And even though she doesn't talk to one of my daughters, they'll get some money because it takes care of the family. Their boundaries. And now we get into debates that academics love. In point of fact, they didn't include farmers in the original act.
Really?
And they didn't include maids.
Really? Huh.
And I needed Southern Democrat votes. Now, if you listen to some defenders of Social Security, they say, this crowd was not racist. This crowd was not sexist. I never met J. Douglas Brown, but his essays on Social Security are worth reading if you're into that sort of stuff. He wasn't racist. He wasn't sexist. Of course, Princeton, the Wilson School, it was the men's school in the 1930s, we believe that was fact. I don't think he was sexist or racist, but the country sure in hell was. The country was. And Frances Perkins, as much as I love her, was hated in Congress because she called a spade, and they didn't like it. The second Bill of Rights, 1944, that's critical because by then we're in war. And Franklin Roosevelt has to be the wartime president dealing with an American economy. Essential to peace is a decent standard of living for all individual men and children and children in all nations. Freedom from fear is essentially linked with freedom from want. Roosevelt will be dead before Hiroshima. Roosevelt will be dead before the UN, which, by the way, Eleanor Roosevelt was instrumental in starting. Roosevelt will be dead before NATO or CETO, and certainly before Biden's weekend deal with Japan and South Korea. But he was thinking universal within boundaries, and it had to be fiscally responsible. It had to have clear communication. If I were Social Security Commissioner, which thank God I'm too old to be and wouldn't want to be in this morass, clear communication has not been good. They talk mumbo jumbo. It's like going to the American Historical Association and showing up at the wrong session. You have no idea what they're talking about, but they know what they're talking about. And you sit there and you go, what the hell are they talking about? I became friends in a previous life with John Himes, who was part of the 1983 Social Security Commission. And he used to walk around with a report card. Is it fiscally accountable? Yes. Does it have open universal? Yes. Do we do good communications? I don't think Hines ever got a D at Yale, but he gave communications D, and it remains the case. As you know, Sergio didn't have to introduce me because the Houston Chronicle finally published an op-ed piece which tells you more about my politics than you care to know. But I speak to you as an Episcopalian. I go most of the time to St. James Church, which is a little bit down the street on South Fork. and the baptismal covenant, which we don't do in contemporary. And frankly, when I was growing up and baptized my two kids, one baptism took place at home with 4 people, and the second baptism took place at about 11 o'clock at night after a cocktail party with a Jesuit priest. But the 1979 prayer book, which is our latest equivalent to your Lutheran covenant, has baptismal vows. They're scary. It's almost worse than a marital vow. I mean, there's no way to get out of rich or poor or sick to self until you have to depart. Oh my God, who in their right minds is going to affirm this, much less before God? But the baptismal vow is just as bad, and they save the best for last. Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? Dignity, dignus, Latin, worth, the integrity of every human being. And will you promote justice? Not barbed wire, but loving justice, restorative justice. The God we worship, actually in communion with Lutherans and Episcopalians, is the God of grace. He's the God of King, Christ the King. But that King came on earth, was incarnate, and was nailed as a felon. And we follow that cross. So we have 20 minutes at least, malign politics, or answer any questions you had about it. That I can't answer.
Can you tell us your history with Social Security, please? That would be helpful.
What an odd question to start with, but coming for you, it's not a surprise. I got drafted, and that was the first serious moral decision I had to make, because most of my classmates suddenly became gay, became conscientious objectors, became anorexic, shot themselves, or went to Canada. And I sat there in 1968 and I said, I'm not perfect, but I'm damn good. But you know, I have to pay taxes and I have to get drafted. My father, who was wounded in the Battle of the Bulge, married my mother overseas in 1945. And they were friends of Eisenhower. So much of my life was around liberal Republicans. My parents were liberal Republicans. And they were just appalled that I would get drafted. Just appalled. But I got drafted. You know, it is something to be in a unit which is 90% black and have your father's lawyer be Senator Scott. And there was one day in which we had to do Beverly Hills walking. It was like a Texas day, although I didn't know what Texas heat really meant until this year. And they gave us half a hot dog. And so I wrote my father's lawyer, Senator Scott, and I said, if you're feeding us for the war, a half a hot dog is not going to do it. Well, Senator Scott graciously wrote my commanding general. And so I had a visit with my commanding general. And I heard King's English spoken in a slightly different dialect than I was accustomed to. And he assured me that I would be the first one on the front lines in Vietnam. They're stupid. They can't be that stupid. And so it turns out they sent me to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where one of my teachers, Henry Steele Commager, said, civilization ends if you can't get the Sunday Times on Sunday. The Sunday Times in Martin, Oklahoma arrived on Thursday. That's it. And so what did they do with me? And so they decided I could watch. I'm actually going to answer your question, but it's going to take 10 minutes because I don't want to have to deal with conservative. And so they let me watch the evening news. And so I reported back to the people in advanced training about the evening news. One night, Richard Nixon, to whom I owe my career, got up and in the 1971 White House Conference on Aging said, I'm going to give tremendous support for old people because I think it's important. And of course, in the 72 election, the 72 amendments were largely to secure that old age vote. And I went, old people. And I went, historians are studying blacks, Abraham Lincoln. I'm good. I'm not that good. What if I study old people? And so I decided to go. And being a snotty Easterner, I went to Harvard. They looked at me and said, huh? I went to Yale, which is where I really wanted to go. And some eminent historians said what my father had said. What the F do you know about old age? And I said, well, you go to the library, you read a lot of books, and you're an Episcopalian, so you shoot for the 51st percentile. They didn't buy it. They said, go to Michigan. And so I went to Michigan. I went back to my father, and he said, they offered you $40,000 of tuition free at Johns Hopkins, and you're going to go to Michigan with no money with an out-of-state tuition. I said, but I have a GI Bill, I'm a drafty. And he said, what the F do you know about old age? Well, it turns out there was this guy named Wilbur Cohen, who had been Whitty's assistant in 1935 Social Security Act, and he was the Dean of Education. And as you probably can guess, I'm sort of an odd dump. And so he and I hit it right off. And so I wrote this dissertation, and it was going to go from 1790 to 1940. And a publisher turned to me and he said, you know, you'd make a lot more money if you brought the story up to date. And I said, I'm going to kill people to get a job that pays $12,000. Do you really think money matters to me? And without missing a beat, the guy said, aren't you the least bit intellectually curious as to what happened after 1940? And I went back and I said, Wilbur, what do I do? No problem. I have all my books in the library and I underlined the key point. So the last chapter of my first book was Wilbur's underlining, for which I still atone. But Wilbur, this is now 1977, and Jimmy Carter, like Jerry Ford, realized that Social Security was in bad shape. And so Carter, Democrat, says, I'm going to tighten disability insurance. And so Wilbur turned to me and said, I want you to quit academics and I want you to work for Save Our Security, which I and Arthur Fleming, who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Eisenhower, were running. And I said, and the pay, it was even less than the $12,000 that I had in my first job. I said, I can't do it, but I'll help you. So from 77 till about 81, I wrote speeches for Wilbur Cohen and Arthur Fleming. And then in 1981, David Stockman, a Michigan congressman who is now Reagan's budget director, said, you know, I can fix this budget. What we're going to do is slice the hell out of Social Security. And so Reagan gets up and says, well, what we're going to do is slice Social Security. And the Senate looked at him and said, 96-0 against that idea. Reagan was no fool. So he turns to Tip O'Neill, the Massachusetts congressman who's Secretary of Speaker of the House, and he says, let's make love. They were an odd couple, but they had work. And so between 82 and 83, I went to Washington, taking a leave from Carnegie Mellon, and interviewed all these people who were working on the 1983 amendments. And then I met the kingmaker of the day, who was Jim Baker, who I don't think gave a damn about Social Security, but he knew this would kill Reagan in his second term if it didn't get passed. The guy was just amazing. I came in prepped like a brown noser saying, so, did you learn about this sort of stuff at the Hill School, which is a student prep center in Pennsylvania? Or did you learn it in Princeton, where his family had gone for 3 generations? And he looked at me and he said, don't think, count votes. And I looked at this guy and I said, don't think, count votes. He knew the 15 people on the committee. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was not exactly his boyfriend. Robert Dole wasn't exactly his friend. They cut a deal with the Center Circle Commission, passed it over to Congress, and then a couple months later, Reagan and O'Neill signed the 1983 amendments, which really did shore up the short-term deficit that was existing. I mean, Stockton was right. But Clinton was going to go bust if they didn't do something. And he dealt with boomers. They raised the retirement age. They covered everybody. Federal employees had been exempt from Social Security until 1983. They raised taxes. It was a compromise that ticked off absolutely everybody. And that's why it worked. And Baker, who knew how to count votes, and is an extraordinary public servant, extraordinary human being, was really the kingpin, I think, even more than Moynihan and O'Neill behind the passage plan. That was the last reform of Social Security. And if you look at the press, if you listen to my boyfriend Tucker talk about Social Security, if you look at what the Biden administration has done, I mean, he wants to preserve it, and he and John Larson in Congress, and people like Ro Kahana are pushing measures. Elizabeth Warren has a measure. John Larson and there are measures there that's not there. So I wrote this book not as the Lutheran Episcopalian, but as a guy who had written a book about Social Security in 1986, which bombed just as much as this book has bombed. But it was a good, honest appraisal of where things were. And my hope is there's a shortfall that's going to take place in the next decade. And depending on who you trust, it's going to take place in 2033 or 2034. People on the alt-right, my politics, right, are saying, oh my God, Chicken Little, it's all over. In point of fact that they do nothing, which I can't believe even they will not do. If they do nothing, there'll be a slight cut. Will there be bankruptcy by the end of the century? It's like people have money in the stock market. Took a hit in 2008, but you kept your money. You keep it now. And I understand why Jeff Bezos could spend everything in the world. He just breathes and interest on his money, just keeps growing, so he's not lost. And I think that's true of Social Security. There was a serious thought that Lyndon Johnson took trust money from Social Security to help pay for the war in Vietnam. And I must admit, my affection for Lyndon Johnson had diminished after the 1965 Voting Act, and I thought it was possible. It can't be done. It's a separate sacred trust, but it needs young people to believe it. And so this book was written for students I no longer teach. And it's essentially saying, you know, let's be honest, if they do nothing, we're in trouble. But if you have measured hope, that's a line I stole from John Allen, psychologist at the Menninger Institute. Measured hope, not giddy hope. I'm not 28 and I'm not in some erotic fantasy, but I'm old enough and cynical enough to believe. And if you can convince younger people that they have a stake themselves in their self-interest, you can overcome fear. Fear is what we're driven by. And I think fear is at the basis of a lot of this polarization. I'm gonna lose my job. I certainly have lost my status. The rich are really incredibly rich. And I mean, I looked at the statistics on the wall coming down on the elevator. 1 out of 4 people in Houston today are hungry. The food crisis here is acute. And so I salute what you do. There are 2 collection plates at the contemplative service. One's for the parish and one's for the agency they're supporting once a month. And I flip checks. I may not be a Lutheran, but I read the 95 Theses a long time ago. And frankly, they weren't as good as the thing you signed last May.
Mary Ann?
I was just wondering, if you see any hope that the divisions we have now and, between the House and Senate, anyone really going to tackle this, or are they gonna wait until someone has a better majority?
You know, the Pollyanna move to me says, I want to wave a magic wand. And as much as I really hope Trump doesn't create a third party or win the Republican nomination, I think it's important he run in 2024, because there must be some Republicans who say he's not Eugene Debs, he cannot be president behind bars. There's a part of me that says, as much as I like old people, it really is the time to retire. And I think Dianne Feinstein should really give way. And as long as I'm picking on people who want to be somewhat bipartisan. I get dizzy in the heat. My brain has bugs when I'm outside for more than 2 minutes. And I'm not the president of the United States, whose son they're making false equivalent of, who has lousy prison rating and has Kamala Harris as his vice president. And I'm not Mitch McConnell, but I understand aphasia. And I understand, and so part of me would say, it's time to put term limits on the Supreme Court, and it's time for people who are 80 to enjoy Washington, to watch the baseball games. Will I change it? Yeah. Will it change for a while? No. I think the real legacy that Trump has left us is this Trump negativism that'll go on for generations. The measured hope. The measured hope is that I'll be partisan. George Bush, not 41, but 43, decided at the beginning of his second term that Social Security was the third rail of American politics. It was sort of like the sacred golden calf of Hebrew scripture. And he was going to touch it. And what he was going to do was privatize it. And no one went along. I'm sure to this day, if he's talking to Laura over the pillow, he goes, that may have been the most colossal mistake I made. I really think the fact that most Americans support Social Security when they're not preoccupied with Harry and Meghan's financial woes, when they're not worried about, whatever they're worried about. Maui, perhaps? How about the Hurricane Hillary that's hitting? I mean, it's really hard to take it all in. And I really do think there's a natural cognitive decline among people our age, and there's just so much you can do. But I think at a certain point, when the left and the right agree, have to do something, they'll do something. It's not rocket science.
Well,
There
we
have been
need some more Jim Bakers.
Sorry?
We need some more Jim Bakers.
Yeah, and we have them. I mean, that's, there's like this generation behind us boomers who hate us, or at least they say they hate us because we're stealing their inheritance. But there are all sorts of people in Congress right now who would say, we're gonna have to raise the ceiling, which is $162,000. I bet Jeff Bezos could afford 6.2% of his billions and help contribute. So I would just raise the ceiling. And then to keep the Republicans happy, I would raise the 6.2% that you pay in payroll taxes to 6.3 and say, see, we're all sharing from this. And frankly, you know, I tried to keep my liberalism intact when I was a professor because I thought boundaries were important. But I would in fact make sure that there was no child, no divorced woman who had to face the vulnerability. And I'd say, that's what America's about.
I didn't catch that, no child.
The incidence of child poverty in this country is much higher than old age poverty. And it's not magical, you know, I mean, there's a reason for this. And it's partly the nature of our structural inequality. I mean, the question will never touch, I think, structural inequality. And it's perfectly clear that that's a big engine that's going on now. But you can deal with Social Security. I mean, if I were God or Social Security Commissioner or President of the United States, it would take me 2 minutes to come up with some solutions that would piss people off. And Jim Baker, if he's still alive, would say, wasn't the hill still? Count the votes.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think this, situation that we may be in with people and government and slowness of things that happen, kind of negative, positive view of the future, where the hell are we going? Is that kind of universal, or is that
You know,
United States?
I married the second woman who came from Mount Holyoke, and we have pillow fights about this all the time.
I know my.
She is absolutely convinced that this is Hungary, this is Barbarossa, this is that crazy guy in Argentina, that crazy guy in Brazil. This is a worldwide phenomenon. There's a reason why anti-Semitism is up, there's a reason why racism is up. And she's smarter than I am, and she's actually much more spiritually attuned than I am. So I don't dismiss what she's saying. But I fly at 24,000 feet, not 39,000 feet. And, you know, I don't buy Brooks' belief that if we could improve moral education, that would be it. And I think Yale's been a long way from teaching moral education when it had ministers as their president. But I do think there's a core of values that have been hidden and latent. And they're really hard to accept when you watch barbed wire, when you watch violence every day. I mean, I wean myself off everything on NBC except Frank Billingsley, who I love to watch tell me there will be no hurricanes, for the hurricanes that come in 6 months. And national news, yeah, I read it in the Times and I wince. Here, Mr. DeSantis, are 5 game rules that you want to do on Wednesday. And you go, it can't be that cynical. And, you know, I taught for a long while and I mentored. And my students taught me a lot. And so my hope ultimately is with you all, who I appreciate for coming, but more especially for your kids.
Well, thank you, Andrew, appreciate
Andy,
this,
I think
Andy.
Andrew.
Okay, good, I just want to be informed on the video. Thank you, Andy, thank you all for participating, this has been a wonderful summer book, review series. We will take a break, next Sunday, because we'll have worship at our West Campus, but, tune in, starting on September 3rd, we will be having Dr. Vivian Ho talk to us about healthcare and the government. So please, stay tuned, and hope you can join us for worship today. I'm making tacos, so I'm gonna go to the kitchen. Take care, God bless you all. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so